We try to pretend like Adolf Hitler is the premier villain of it all. No, Stalin was pretty fucking bad too. Same thing with Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini's people hated him so much that when they recaptured him, they mutilated his body and urinated all over it. If only we had a day here in America where we could pay it forward to our politicians. Winston Churchill was a dirty, dirty man. His morality was non-existent, and his politics were, bar none, the most selfish in Europe at the time. Of course, what do you expect from a man who has no conscience? When you hear him tell his boring speech, we will fight in the hills. We will fight in the heavens. We will fight in the shite. We will fight in the shire. Fuck off, dude. And then, of course, the unabashed plea to the American people. And the American president, of course. And the British folks, man, with their British sensibilities, they don't want to have that part mentioned. That in that famous speech, they always cut it off, literally right before he mentions America. Those of you who pay attention to history know that America didn't join the war until 2 years later. The first bombing raids against civilian targets were perpetrated by who? The British. That's right. When it comes to wholesale slaughter of civilian populations, where did those orders come from? Like the bombing of Dresden. My God, that really takes an extremely inhumane person to do such a thing. Now, why is it that Winston Churchill went and bombed a civilian population in 1939? That wouldn't be Dresden, by the way. Why did he have that done? Well, because a victory was more important than anything else to Winston Churchill, much like many of you, even if it's by fighting dirty. All's fair in love and war, they say. And of course, to the victor goes the spoils, including written history. Now we come to realize recently through modern archaeology and also through many unclassified documents that were once classified. Turns out Winston Churchill was a heartless sumbitch. Alright, so there was not unrestricted warfare like we like to pretend. We like to pretend that the Germans were out there, no warning, just sinking civilian ships, targeting just civilian ships. And although, yes, they were targeting just civilian ships, it was very specific civilian ships. They were ordered to not engage with warships if at all possible. But if it was an escorted convoy, you either wanted to destroy the escorts so you could take out the convoy without any problems, or you wanted to pop a few shots in there, get underneath the waves, and go hide. Now, the Germans, through the entire war, even though Admiral Dönitz was a diehard fucking Nazi, he got a fucking chicken scratch. He got a slap on the wrist at the end of the war, while all of his colleagues and comrades were either divvied out as property to Great Britain or the United States or, of course, Russia. Yeah, we divvied out their scientists. We divvied out their top officials and traded them like baseball cards, like we do here in America with homeless people. So, the Germans during World War II, they actually followed international law through the entire war. How insane is that? When Great Britain is making every excuse to break international law and use that as an excuse, like bombing a civilian population. And don't get me wrong, that was a brilliant tactic. You go accidentally drop some bombs on civilian targets, and next thing you know, the German people are too up in arms and thinking in blood to think rationally. If they'd have continued pounding the airfields, the war would have been over and Germany would have won it. Now, when we call it World War II, we mostly focus on when the Russians were on the British side and so were the Americans. Then it's World War II. Before that, it was basically a private war. And just so you know, Germany at no point in time had any chance of winning the war. The reason for that is because they chose to mess with Russia. That was stupid. That was very, very stupid. Now, as far as the war with just Great Britain, if he hadn't gone after Russia, yes, most certainly they could have taken over that dinky little island with a little bit of nothing. As far as getting over there goes, you know, another week and a half worth of bombing airfields would have been enough. And that's even given the fact that the British were outproducing the Germans at that point. That's right. Within 30 days of initial combat, the British were already outbuilding the Luftwaffe. They were outbuilding what the Germans were capable of, even with all of their glorious resources, because, well, they stuck with a few set patterns and just built the hell out of them. The Germans did not stick with set patterns. When you look at the Focke-Wulf 190, which wasn't even in the Battle of Britain, I mean, you're looking at a lot of different variants, the same as there's a lot of different variants of the Spitfire. But for the most part, the Spitfire's changes were to the power plant, that would be the engine, and the armament, that would be the guns. Other than a square-tipped wing on a couple of the models, they looked identical. Oh, and of course, when you put an engine in there that's 2.5 feet longer than the previous one, you tend to have a little bit longer nose. The reason that they took the squared off wings off of the Spitfire, the reason that they made it so it went back to the rounded wing edges is because all right, you're fighting in the sun. You're down below the clouds, you got a little bit of light in your eyes, and then of course you get above the clouds and there's a lot of light in your eyes. You see the rounded tips of your squadron leader. You know it's your squadron leader. You know that he's in a Spitfire because the Germans don't run anything with the rounded wings. All their stuff is squared off at the ends. But if you're a squadron leader, you pop up above the clouds, you get that light in your eyes, and your squadron leader pops up. He's got them square edges, and you're used to fighting against square edges, and you're used to protecting the rounded edges. You know what? It might just be a reaction shot, and your squadron leader's going down into the drink. The drink would be the English Channel. Any lake or body of water is also considered the drink. You're making a waterborne landing. But what we have is Winston Churchill intentionally, knowingly, and willingly making sure that the British population and British civilians are specifically targeted. How did they force the Germans into a situation where they were trying to claim that the Germans were just sinking any ship at random? That they weren't giving a a warning, which by law was required. Well, they did give a warning. During the time of the war that they did not give warning, well, that's because the unrestricted warfare was both ways. The British submarines at no point during the war actually followed the international laws when that went, or as far as that went. When it came to Admiral Dönitz, the only reason that he wasn't hung with the rest of his Nazi buddies is because the United States took a look at its former enemy at the end of the war, and they took a look at their former ally at the end of the war. No, the British at the end of World War II were not our allies. They were our competition, same as Russia. If you take a look at where Winston Churchill wanted to send American boys for fighting, these are all British colonies. They're sending American boys in World War II instead of going after the enemy. Winston Churchill, knowing that if there's an end of the war there and the United States is involved in signing the end of the war, well, it's much like with Ukraine and Russia. Both sides know that the war is going to end, and both sides know that the territory that they have taken over is probably what they're going to have at the end of it. Unless there is special international conferences and other nations that get involved with sanctions and say, hey, this is how we're going to allow it. And you guys just need to go along with it and get along. If they decide they're going to have some peace talks, and let's say the Ukraine takes over the Crimea, and they have it at the last day of the war, the Crimea, technically, according to the rules of war, Crimea is theirs. It's theirs to keep. The war is over. It's conquest. And it's called right of conquest. You might want to write that down and look it up. The British submarines in World War II, what would they do? They see a target with a German flag, they sink it. No ifs, no ands, no buts. They sink it. They wouldn't give a warning, wouldn't fire a flare, wouldn't nothing. They would just sink it. Even in the last days of the war, German U-boats were informing merchant captains, if they caught them alone, they were informing merchant captains, hey, we're going to sink your boat. We're going to follow the law, even though in the 6 hours that we're inspecting your ship and allowing you to get your lifeboats prepared and all of that, and that's 6 hours that allows their opponents, the British, to show up and do something with their overwhelming air superiority, with their overwhelming sea superiority, and of course, the overwhelming American everything superiority. And knowing that they were probably going to get sunk, they still tried to follow those orders because Dönitz required it. He even stood up to Adolf Hitler in that respect, saying if you're going to do what it is that you're wanting to do, you got to find another man to do it. But it all came down to the very beginning of the war. We had some Type 7 submarines. That's the primary subtype that was operating in the English Channel and around Great Britain. And on multiple occasions, they literally saved the lives of British citizens, British civilians. And the British, even though, like for example, Gunther Priam, right? This guy is famous for all sorts of crazy exploits in U-boats. But he also is well known because multiple times before he sank a ship, he allowed the women and the children off of the boat. And he would try to take them to a neutral ship or a neutral port. And the reason that I bring up Gunther, despite the fact that nearly all of the U-boat crews did such a thing, is because he is such a big name and people want to talk about his exploits, but they leave out that part. There are also quite a few specials on the History Channel where there's people who remember meeting him, like women who were, 6, 7 years old at the time, and they got to ride on a German U-boat after that German U-boat sunk their boat, or after another German U-boat sunk their boat, or after a British cruise liner ran into a British warship and both of them sank. Had nothing to do with German submarine. It was two British ships or two Allied ships. I'm pretty sure the cruise liner was not British because most of their cruise liners had been converted. However, just because it was a converted cruise liner doesn't mean that it wasn't called a cruise liner. We know that was it the Queen Mary, I believe, that was turned into a hospital ship, but it was still a passenger liner. It just had conversions. But in all of those cases, even though the Germans were doing what they were supposed to according to international law, and even though the British were not doing what they were supposed to according to international law, the British literally targeted their own civilians to sink those boats, knowing that those boats were doing the moral thing, but sinking the U-boat and selling your own story at the end was more important. When it comes to Nazi politics, that's one of the things we have here in the United States that's a big issue. Telling soldiers that the politics don't matter. Your job is to do as you're told. Well, look at what we did to Nazis who did what they were told. We hung them. We literally hung them for doing as they're told. We hung them for following orders. While here in the United States, they say they're just doing their job. They're just doing their job. Well, other than Admiral Dönitz, none of the Nazis did their jobs. And other than the United States, none of the Allied powers did their jobs. I mean, even France, end of World War II, they have their own country due to the fact that a lot of other people went to bat for them while they were laying down and taking it. They're the equivalent of Natalie Bollinger. Sure, she's the one that got screwed over. She's the one that ended up dead. She's the one that ended up, well, bowing down to her predators' every will and command. We know who the Vichy French were. We know what they did for the Germans. But not all French are Vichy. We forget about our allies, like the French, for example. The United States especially likes to forget the Marquis de Lafayette, the El Hermione, and the contributions that they gave to Nathaniel Greene in his campaign. Somebody just typed something at me. I don't know who it is, but apparently their name is Buddy, or they think my name is Buddy. That's all I was able to read before before I started saying it, or before it clicked off. Now it's just a little red one in the corner of the little round thing. Anyway, when you've got honorable sea captains that we have out on the sea, and they're literally rescuing women and children. They're taking women and children off of boats that they're going to sink and allowing them that. And the British, they didn't do that through the entirety of the war. The British fought a very dirty battle. And all of the dirtiest shit that the Germans ever did either came from British example, American example, Italian example, or Japanese example. They looked at the Japanese and the Italians, see what works, and adapt it. As far as the examples of the British, at the end of the war, there were even Allied nations that felt that not only Winston Churchill, but much of the British hierarchy should have been on the gallows next to those Nazis. I am anti-Nazi, not anti-German. I am against selling false narratives. I'm not against the British people as a whole. I'm against the British telling us about how Americans started the slave trade, pushing American slavery on Americans and shoving that at us for years and years. Who started shipping black people from Africa to the North American continent? His name was Sir Francis Drake. The journey itself was financed by the Queen of England at the time. Who was the Queen of England at the time? Queen Elizabeth I. That's right, the Virgin Queen. Or the Virgin Queen whore, depending on your definition of virgin and your definition of whore. It's the whole rebirth thing. She wanted to pretend like because she was a monarchy, she gets to magically, ritualistically become a virgin again. While other women in the country are literally being burned at the stake for having sex. Literally being beaten to death. Beaten to death for public spectacle. For accusations of cheating on their husband. During Victorian times, a woman who was horny could be beaten to death. You all talk about how horrible it was in Jesus' day when they'd stone him with rocks. You know, that's a lot quicker way to die than being whipped to death. I wouldn't want to go either way. But if I had my choice in the matter, I'd rather take the rock to the skull than the whip to the back. Winston Churchill, a lot of the stuff that they did to the U-boats, and don't get me wrong, I understand why they did it. Those U-boats, according to the British Admiralty's own guesstimations, would have taken between 11 and 14 boats more at the beginning of the war to actually win it. Now, given the fact that Germany had over 60 U-boats at the very beginning of the war that could have been used, and they had less than 25 that were actually out there doing it, they actually did have the numbers at the very beginning of the war. They just weren't using them. And of course, until American destroyers, World War I destroyers, were sold to the British in exchange for overseas landing strips, the British didn't have the boats to try to capture, take over, or sink any of the U-boats. They just didn't have the human resources. They didn't have the ships that were actually able to be utilized. Some of the ships that they had in Scapa Flow, they hadn't been used or maintained since 1918. They had literally just sat there collecting seawater. The British Admiralty, through nearly the entirety of World War II, it wasn't until the end of 1943 and beginning in 1944 when the Germans were really in decline, really hurting on manpower, really hurting on resources, and didn't have a whole lot of access to precious metals that were extremely important for the things that they wanted to build. For example, the Junkers Umo 004 engine. That's the very first combat jet fighter was the Messerschmitt 262. The Junkers Umo 004 engine is the engine that went into it. Well, they had to make it out of just regular steel, so it had a shelf life, or an operational life, of up to 10 hours of flight time. That means you make 2 to 3 flights and you have to replace both engines. That gets costly. Now, what they should have done it with is with stainless steel, which they already knew about at the time. However, with their access to that steel being non-existent due to they were basically neutral with Turkey, unlike in World War I. And Turkey was the only place at the time for them to get chrome or chromium. And chromium is an important and essential element in making stainless steel. Also, nickel is as well. Anyway, when you got submarines that are trying to offload a valid target, you want to ship tanks and ammunition and guns on a civilian cruise liner, keep in mind that you are breaking international law by doing so, that those submarines do have the right to sink your boat, and that if you try to run, they're allowed to take that as a sign that you're doing something wrong or carrying illegal cargo. It's not illegal internationally to transport cargo from the United States, who was not at war with Germany at the time, to Great Britain, who was at war with Germany at the time. It is illegal to put those things on civilian transport ships. Sorry, civilian passenger liners. That's smuggling. And it also makes the passenger liner captain and anybody on board his ship who saw or had anything to do with the loading or unloading of said munitions and more supplies, they can be hung or shot as spies, according to the Geneva Convention. But before that, they could be shot or hung as spies. It didn't take the Geneva Convention to make that. It took the Geneva Convention for people to take all of these rules of war and put them down in one place and say, hey, this is what we need to abide by. And in all of that, they don't abide by any of it, do they? Matter of fact, Germany, not Germany, I can't say Germany because that's not right. The Germans were dirty, dirty fighters. But it was the German U-boats in World War II. They're the ones who fought a clean battle. They're the ones who understood camaraderie, and they're the ones that had some respect for human life. While Winston Churchill didn't care about his own people, if having his own people targeted, or him sending the RAF to bomb the shit out of civilians who were rescued by Germans. They say, oh, well, we were trying to hit the U-boat. You only knew the U-boat was there because the U-boat was letting you know about human beings who are your sovereign citizens. These are citizens of Great Britain, a sovereign nation, and rather than taking them as, well, slave labor for the concentration camps, they tried to arrange for those civilians to be returned to England, even against the Führer's orders. We don't have to agree with the politics. We can respect at least that preservation of human life was important for that one group of young sailors. The average age of a submariner in World War II was 19 years old. That's the average age. What's the average age of a soldier in the United States military today? 29? Alright, so I'm going to end this video. Winston Churchill was a dirty man who cared about empire. He showed that in World War I when he was the Grand Admiral of the fleet. That's what Karl Dönitz was. Well, that was what Winston Churchill was the equivalent of in World War I. He was in charge of everything in the Navy. But he was more of a bookman than anything else. I mean, here's a Navy guy who gave us the modern advent of tanks. It was his foresight in World War I that brought those about. And then, of course, it was the Germans in World War II who showed the effectiveness of it by utilizing... You guys may never have heard of this man before. His name is George S. Patton. He was a tank commander in World War I. He was also involved in the hunt for Pancho Villa. Patton was not a good man. Not by any stretch or measure of the imagination. But we try to pretend that he was a good man because he won victoriously. Kind of like Alexander the Great won victoriously. But the reality of it is, it was dirty. It was very dirty. And very much the victors get to sell their own rendition today. But we've also got historians from Great Britain. They don't hold that bias that was once there. The hatred for the Germans. How dare you ever say anything good about the Germans in World War II? How dare you insinuate that Great Britain or our wonderful Savior Churchill could ever do any wrong? Well, he did. He did a lot of wrong things, including targeting his own civilians, including targeting people who were rescued after being immorally put on a boat with illegal weapons on board. The British knew that they were fighting a dirty war, and the British knew that they were lying to the entire world, and the British knew that North Africa didn't actually mean jack shit in the scheme of things. They could have stopped the war over 2 years earlier before proper and full defenses were set up along the coast of France. But you know what? Winston Churchill wanted to keep the empire together. Wanted to keep all of those brown people that were enslaved in other countries under the British banner. He wanted to keep those people enslaved. As we know, slavery in the British island itself has been illegal since 1066. But only on the island itself. That's why Sir Francis Drake and Queen Elizabeth I were able to start the slave trade here in the United States. The very slave trade the British say, oh, well, we don't do that. It's been illegal here since 1066. Yeah, it was illegal on the island itself. It was ignored when it happened here in the United States, or paid for by the monarchy itself. Same thing in India, same thing in Africa, same thing in the East Indies and the West Indies, same thing in the Philippines. The British wanted to maintain empire during the war. That's what was important to them. The French had to try to play catch up after the war because they got their asses whooped. One thing Americans don't know, because we don't heavily advertise it, is that the American Revolution would have been over in just a matter of months if it hadn't been for the French. They turned the American Revolution into a global war. We didn't have a navy at the time. What we had during the Revolutionary War was a bunch of skiffs, a bunch of rowboats, a bunch of smugglers. Yep, a bunch of civilian craft with civilian people on them that were carrying war munitions and supplies. Don't get me wrong, we had some big ships in port. Most of them we had to burn when we retreated, or the British burned on the way in or the way out, or they captured them. Most of them without ever having a fight, without even a shot fired. We had such an issue manning crews for ships that we just ultimately took the guns off the boats. I mean, they were British cannons anyway, British ships anyway. They just happened to be in a friendly port when the war started. If it hadn't been for the French engaging the English and their navy worldwide, Great Britain would have had the manpower and would have had the navy to blockade every American port. And they would have had the ability to put up to 250,000 troops on American shores. That's a lot more people than George Clinton had. Can you imagine if it had been 3,000 Revolutionary Warriors against 5,000 English soldiers? That was about the average size of the engagements. There was about 3,000 people on average engaging on the American side, and about 5,000 on average engaging on the British side. Imagine if it would have been 3,000 against 250,000. Not that every British soldier would have been sent. Not that they would have sent 250,000. But the thing is, when you've got your warships all tied up, they can't exactly transport or help to set up a convoy system to protect ships that are bringing over soldiers. We exist as a nation very specifically because of 3 Frenchmen. One of them was an admiral, a French admiral. One of them was a French general. And my very favorite was an American general. The youngest American general in American history to this day, the Marquis de Lafayette. Great Britain lost their empire, and in losing their empire, they became dependent upon America. Great Britain depends highly upon America to this day. And that's because we had President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his master plan for tearing apart all empires. Kind of reminds me of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I may not get there with you. He didn't make it to the end of the war. He didn't make it long enough to see the end of empire. But it came. Sure enough, it came. Like a foul wind to the boot of your backsides. If you got a boot shoved up your backside, your farts are going to get pretty stale, pretty nasty, and build up a lot of pressure. Your shit stinks, bud. Your ignorance gets people killed. And history is not cut and dry, black and white. When it come to anti-Semitism in World War II, it was worldwide. Worldwide anti-Semitism after 1918. Good to be rid of you. Thanks for coming to visit. Stay out of trouble or don't get caught. Remember, you are your brother's keeper, and no victim left behind. Not even if they're killed by your own people. If the British RAF wants to bomb British civilians, well, those civilians are still victims. It doesn't matter that it was the RAF who did it and not the Luftwaffe. Keep fighting that Nazi mentality. Those of you who speak up, thank you for speaking up. The whole 2 of you that exist in this country.